In the heart of the remote countryside, where the nights stretch long and silence hangs heavy over the land, there are stories too old to ignore. They are whispered between families, passed from grandmothers to children around flickering fires, warnings wrapped in folklore. And yet, these stories always carry an undercurrent of truth. Truth so deeply rooted that even the most rational minds find themselves questioning what lies just beyond the edge of the trees. One such story belongs to Lechuza. She is not an ordinary creature. Her name is spoken with caution, often followed by the sign of the cross. Some say she was once a bruiser, a powerful witch who sought vengeance upon a town that betrayed her. Others believe she is an ancient being, something far older than humanity, drawn to fear and despair like a moth to flame. Regardless of her origins, one detail is always the same. Lechuza takes the form of a giant owl, its wings as wide as a man is tall, its face disturbingly human. In the small town of Arroyo Blanco, nestled at the edge of a dense forest, the legend of Lechuza was more than a tale, it was a reality. Generations of townsfolk had grown up with warnings to stay inside after dark, to never respond to strange cries, and to resist the urge to investigate shadows in the night. And for years, the town had been quiet, untouched by the curse. Until one night, a cry shattered the stillness. It was a sound that woke Marisol Sanchez from a dead sleep, a baby's wail, faint yet distinct, drifting through the open window of her small farmhouse. At first, she thought she had imagined it, but then it came again, louder this time, and her heart quickened. Her first instinct was to get up and investigate. What mother could ignore the sound of a crying child? But as she rose from her bed, an unease settled over her, heavy and suffocating. The cry came again, and she noticed something strange. It wasn't moving. The sound stayed in one spot, just beyond the window, as though the baby were floating in place. Marisol's hands trembled as she reached for the curtain. She pulled it back just enough to see outside, and what she saw made her blood run cold. There, perched on the fence post, was a massive owl. Its feathers gleamed white in the moonlight, but its face was unmistakably human. The eyes, wide and unblinking, locked onto hers with an intensity that rooted her to the spot. The mouth moved slightly, as if forming words, though no sound came. And then it let out another cry, but this time, it wasn't the cry of a baby. It was a shriek, high-pitched and piercing, that seemed to shake the very walls of the house. Marisol stumbled back, pulling the curtain closed with trembling hands. She backed away from the window, her heart pounding in her chest. The cries stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It was as though the air itself had been sucked out of the room. She didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. And when morning finally came, she found claw marks on the wooden frame of the window, deep and jagged, as though something had tried to force its way inside. When she told her neighbors what had happened, they exchanged uneasy glances. "It's her," one of them whispered. "Lechuza is back." Marisol wasn't the only one who had heard the cries that night. Others in the town reported strange occurrences. Livestock found dead with no apparent cause, shadows flitting across windows, and the faint sound of wings in the darkness. The town was gripped by fear, but no one dared to say it aloud. No one wanted to acknowledge that the legend might be real. But deep down, they all knew. Lechuza had returned to Arroyo Blanco. Arroyo Blanco was a town accustomed to silence, its nights broken only by the soft rustling of leaves or the distant howls of coyotes. But after the night of the cries, the silence felt oppressive, weighted by the collective fear of the townsfolk. Whispers spread like wildfire, moving from house to house, each retelling of the events adding another layer of dread. Marisol's story had set the town on edge, but it wasn't the only one. By the end of the week, others had come forward, describing encounters that sent chills through even the most skeptical. Rosa, the widow who lived near the woods, claimed she had heard the sound of a baby crying outside her window, followed by what she described as the beating of enormous wings. At dawn, she found her chicken coop empty, the ground littered with feathers and blood. Another man, Arturo, the local butcher, swore he had seen something large swoop across the sky while driving home late at night. He described it as an owl, but much larger than any bird he had ever seen. Its wings, he said, his voice trembling, were so wide they blocked the moonlight. By the time the sun set each evening, the streets of Arroyo Blanco were deserted. Windows were shuttered, doors locked, and prayers murmured in homes lit only by the glow of candles. The townsfolk avoided looking outside, even when they heard the faint cries or the ominous rustle of wings. But the unease wasn't confined to the nights. In the daylight, a sense of dread lingered. Farmers found their livestock dead, their throats ripped open by something with claws far larger than any predator known to the area. Children spoke of seeing shadows in the woods, and even the town's stray dogs, usually fearless, refused to wander near the forest's edge. Despite the mounting fear, the town's sheriff, Manuel Ortiz, remained skeptical. He dismissed the reports as the product of superstition and overactive imaginations. There's a perfectly logical explanation for all of this, he insisted during a town meeting, though his tone lacked conviction. But his skepticism wavered after an incident that shook even his hardened resolve. Late one night, a call came from the Morales family, who lived on the outskirts of town. Their youngest son, Diego, had vanished from his bedroom. The parents had woken to find his window wide open, claw marks gouged into the frame, and no trace of the boy except for a trail of feathers leading into the woods. A search party was formed at first light, but the forest yielded no answers. The only sign of Diego was a single shoe, found near an ancient oak tree, its laces shredded as though torn by something sharp. Sheriff Ortiz returned from the woods pale and shaken, his usual air of confidence replaced by a grim silence. The Morales family, overcome with grief, sought answers from Father Mateo, the town's aging priest. Father Mateo had lived in Arroyo Blanco his entire life and had heard the stories of La Lechuza since he was a boy. Reluctantly, he confirmed what many in the town feared. The signs are there, he said. The cries, the feathers, the claw marks, it is her. The priest shared the legend of La Lechuza, explaining that she was no ordinary creature. According to the tales, she was a bruiser who had been wronged by the town's ancestors centuries ago. Condemned and burned for her sorcery, she had cursed the town with her dying breath, vowing to return in the form of an owl to claim the lives of their descendants. The townsfolk, now fully gripped by fear, turned to Father Mateo for guidance. He advised them to keep their windows closed and their homes blessed with holy water. And whatever you do, he warned, do not answer the cries. It is how she lures you. Despite the precautions, the sightings continued. A group of teenagers, emboldened by curiosity and the bravado of youth, ventured into the woods one night with flashlights and a video camera. They returned an hour later, their faces pale and their breaths ragged. The video they brought back showed little more than shadows and indistinct shapes, but the audio captured a sound that sent chills down the spines of all who heard it. A baby's wail, followed by the unmistakable shriek of something inhuman. Word of the teenagers' footage spread quickly, drawing the attention of Sofia Mendoza, a journalist working on a documentary about urban legends. Sofia was known for her skeptical approach, debunking myths with logic and reason. When she arrived in Arroyo Blanco, she dismissed the tales of La Lechuza as nothing more than mass hysteria. But as she began interviewing the townsfolk, Sophia found it increasingly difficult to explain away the accounts. The claw marks, the feathers, the missing boy, all pointed to something far beyond the ordinary. Her skepticism began to waver when she visited the Morales home and saw the shredded window frame for herself. That night, Sophia stayed in Arroyo Blanco, determined to uncover the truth. As she sat in her motel room, reviewing her notes, she heard it. The faint cry of a baby, drifting through the air like a ghostly echo. Her rational mind told her it was impossible, but the sound was unmistakable. She stepped to the window and hesitated. She thought of Marisol's story, of Father Mateo's warnings, and of the fear that gripped the town. Slowly, she pulled back the curtain, and what she saw made her breath catch in her throat. A massive owl perched on the telephone pole outside, its feathers glowing white in the moonlight. Its eyes, unnaturally large and unblinking, seemed to pierce straight through her. And then, as if sensing her gaze, it turned its head slowly to reveal a human face. A face twisted in an expression of anger and sorrow. The cry came again, louder this time, and Sophia stumbled back from the window, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't sleep that night, her mind racing with questions and a growing sense of unease. The legend of La Lechuza was no longer just a story. It was real, and it was watching. Sophia Mendoza was no stranger to danger. As a journalist, she had ventured into conflict zones and chased down elusive leads, all in the pursuit of truth. But nothing she had encountered could compare to the dread that clung to Arroyo Blanco like a heavy fog. She had come to the town seeking answers, but now she found herself questioning the very foundation of what she believed. The encounter at the motel haunted her. The sight of the owl with its human-like face, the eerie cries, the unrelenting stare. It was as if the creature was warning her, daring her to come closer. And despite the fear it inspired, Sophia couldn't bring herself to leave. Something about the legend of La Lechuza felt incomplete, as though the true story lay just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Sophia began interviewing more residents. Each account added another layer to the legend, but one name kept surfacing: Father Emilio. The town's priest seemed to know more about La Lechuza than he was willing to share, and Sophia decided to confront him directly. She found him in the church, his weary frame bent over the altar as he whispered prayers under his breath. When she approached, he looked up, his eyes reflecting a mixture of exhaustion and fear. "You've seen her," he said, his voice low. It wasn't a question. Sophia nodded. "I need to know the truth. Who, what, is La Lechuza? Why is she here? And why now?" Father Emilio hesitated, his gaze shifting to the stained glass windows as though seeking guidance. Finally, he spoke. "La Lechuza was once human," he began. "Her name was Isabel Ortega, and she lived here centuries ago, when this town was little more than a handful of farms. She was a healer, a midwife, but she was also something more. The people of that time feared her, though they relied on her for help. When crops failed or illness spread, they turned to Isabel. But when misfortune struck, they blamed her." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "One year, the harvest failed completely. The townsfolk, desperate and starving, accused Isabel of cursing the land. They dragged her to the square, where they condemned her as a witch. She was burned alive." Sophia's stomach turned at the thought. "And she cursed them." With her dying breath, Father Emilio said, She vowed to return, to take vengeance on the descendants of those who had betrayed her. Her spirit took the form of the owl, a creature that can move between the worlds of the living and the dead. And every generation, she comes back to claim what she believes is hers. Sophia frowned. But why now? What triggered her return? The priest shook his head. I don't know. Perhaps the faith of this town has waned. Perhaps her vengeance is eternal. Later that night, Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The motel room felt suffocating, its walls too close, the shadows too deep. She decided to venture out, camera in hand, determined to document whatever she could find. She drove to the edge of the woods where many of the sightings had occurred. The forest loomed before her, its trees twisted and gnarled, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. As she stepped out of her car, the silence enveloped her, broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath her boots. The deeper she went, the colder the air became. Her flashlight flickered, casting long, shifting shadows that played tricks on her mind. And then she heard it, a faint cry, distant yet unmistakable. Sophia froze, her breath catching in her throat. The cry came again, louder this time, and closer. It sounded like a baby, helpless and alone. Against her better judgment, she moved toward the sound, her camera recording every step. The cries led her to a clearing where an ancient oak tree stood, its roots sprawling like claws across the earth. At its base was an altar, crude yet unmistakable, covered in feathers and streaked with something dark. Sophia's hands trembled as she filmed the scene, her instincts screaming at her to run. And then she saw it. Perched on one of the tree's lower branches was Lechuza. Her wings were massive, spreading wide as she watched Sophia with unblinking eyes. The human face was grotesque, its expression shifting between anger and sorrow. The creature let out a screech that pierced the night, and Sophia stumbled backward, dropping her flashlight. In the chaos, her camera captured everything. The shadow of the owl as it took flight, the sound of wings beating the air, and Sophia's own ragged breathing as she ran blindly through the woods. She emerged onto the road, her body shaking, her mind racing. When she finally dared to review the footage, she saw the figure clearly, its face, its wings, and its piercing eyes. And behind it, in the darkness of the clearing, faint symbols etched into the ground glowed with an unnatural light. Sophia realized then that this was no mere haunting. This was something ancient, something bound to Arroyo Blanco by blood and vengeance. And she had just stepped into its domain. Sophia Mendoza returned to her motel room with trembling hands and a heart that refused to calm. The footage she had captured was undeniable. The creature, Lechuza, was real. Its twisted, human-like face stared back at her from the tiny screen of her camera, and the glowing symbols at the base of the ancient oak seemed to pulse with an energy that lingered even in memory. But more pressing than her fear was the realization that she was now a part of the story. Whatever Lechuza was, whatever force tethered it to Arroyo Blanco, it had noticed her. The scratches on her car door and the feathers she found on the windshield the next morning confirmed as much. The town was gripped by an escalating terror. The Morales family, still mourning their missing son Diego, reported hearing scratching at their door each night, accompanied by the sound of wings flapping overhead. Others found dead animals, dogs, chickens, even a horse, left mutilated on their properties. And yet no one dared to confront the creature. Father Emilio, despite his warnings, sought Sophia out the following day. His face was drawn, his usually steady hands clasped tightly around a rosary. "You've seen her," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She doesn't show herself to just anyone. She's chosen you. Sophia felt a chill crawl up her spine. Chosen me for what? The priest hesitated before answering. The curse isn't random. It ties her to those whose ancestors wronged her. But it's more than that. La Lechuza feeds on fear and despair, and the more we succumb to it, the stronger she becomes. You've seen the altar, haven't you? Sophia nodded, recalling the blood-stained stones and the glowing symbols etched into the ground. Father Emilio leaned closer, his voice urgent. The altar is the key. It binds her to this place. If we destroy it, we might be able to break the curse. But doing so won't be easy. She'll defend it with everything she has. Sophia's instincts screamed at her to walk away. She had come to Arroyo Blanco to document a story, not to become a part of it. But the guilt she felt for the Morales family, for Diego, weighed heavily on her. She agreed to help, though she wasn't entirely sure what that meant. That night, Sophia delved deeper into the town's history. In the dusty archives of the old town hall, she uncovered records dating back to the 1700s, detailing the trial and execution of Isabel Ortega. The records described how Isabel had been accused of witchcraft after a series of misfortunes befell the town. Failed crops, a devastating fire, and a mysterious illness that claimed several lives. One passage caught Sophia's attention. She cursed us with her final breath. The flames consumed her body, but her spirit did not perish. I will return in the shadow of the owl, she said, her voice carrying over the crackle of the fire. And your children's children will pay for what you have done. As Sophia pieced together the story, a disturbing realization dawned on her. The Morales family, the livestock deaths, the claw marks on homes, all of it was connected to the descendants of those who had condemned Isabel. And as she traced the family trees further, her blood ran cold. Her own great-grandfather's name appeared on the list of men who had served as jurors in Isabel's trial. Sophia felt the weight of this revelation settle over her like a suffocating shroud. The creature wasn't just targeting the town, it was targeting her. And it wasn't going to stop until the curse was fulfilled. The following evening, Sophia and Father Emilio prepared to confront La Lechuza. Armed with gasoline, matches, and a blessed rosary, they ventured into the woods, their flashlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. The air was thick, the silence broken only by the sound of their footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. The altar appeared before them like a wound in the earth, its stones dark with dried blood and surrounded by the faintly glowing symbols. Sophia's camera captured every detail, though she wasn't sure anyone would ever see the footage. As they approached, a sudden gust of wind extinguished their flashlights. The cries began, distant at first, then closer, echoing through the trees. A baby's wail, a woman's scream, and the deafening beat of massive wings. She's here, Father Emilio whispered, clutching his rosary tightly. The creature appeared in a blur of motion, its massive wings spreading as it landed on the altar. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and its human-like face twisted into a grotesque sneer. Sophia and Father Emilio barely had time to react before the creature lunged. Father Emilio raised his rosary, shouting a prayer, while Sophia fumbled with the gasoline canister. The creature shrieked, its cry piercing enough to make their ears ring. Sophia managed to douse the altar in gasoline, her hands trembling as she struck a match. But before she could throw it, La Lechuza's talons caught her shoulder, dragging her to the ground. Father Emilio intervened, shouting the incantation he had memorized from ancient texts. The creature hesitated, its body writhing as though caught between two worlds. Sophia seized the opportunity, throwing the lit match onto the altar. The flames roared to life, consuming the blood-soaked stones and the glowing symbols. Lechuza let out a deafening screech, its wings flailing as it tried to take flight. But the fire spread quickly, engulfing the altar and the creature in a blaze of light. Sophia and Father Emilio stumbled back, shielding their eyes from the inferno. The screams of the creature echoed through the woods, a sound that would haunt Sophia's dreams for the rest of her life. When the fire finally died, the altar was nothing more than ash. The woods fell silent, the oppressive weight of the curse lifted. But as Sophia and Father Emilio made their way back to town, a single feather drifted down from the sky, landing at Sophia's feet. The curse may have been broken, but Lechuza's presence lingered, a reminder that some forces cannot be entirely vanquished. The fire at the altar had burned away the symbols, the blood, and the remnants of whatever tethered Lechuza to Arroyo Blanco. For the first time in weeks, the oppressive dread that hung over the town seemed to lift. But Sofia Mendoza couldn't shake the feeling that their battle wasn't over. The feather she had found at her feet, a pristine white plume, almost glowing in the moonlight, felt like a warning. As she held it in her trembling hands, the cries of Lechuza echoed in her memory, a haunting reminder of the creature's unearthly power. Father Emilio reassured her as best he could. "The altar is destroyed," he said, his voice steady but his eyes uncertain. "Without it, she has no anchor to this world." But Sophia wasn't convinced. The curse felt too deeply rooted, too personal. And as she reviewed her footage from that night, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. In the final moments of the fire, just as the creature was consumed by the flames, its human-like face had turned toward the camera. Its lips moved, forming a word Sophia couldn't hear but could unmistakably read. "You." The following days in Arroyo Blanco were quiet, almost eerily so. The cries of Lechuza no longer pierced the nights, and the strange occurrences that had plagued the town seemed to stop altogether. Livestock remained unharmed, the shadows in the woods stayed still, and the whispers ceased. But Sophia couldn't rest. She had always trusted her instincts, and they screamed that something was wrong. The town may have been spared, but she wasn't. Lechuza had chosen her. It began subtly, a flicker of movement in her peripheral vision, the sensation of being watched when she was alone. At first, she convinced herself it was her imagination, the lingering effects of fear. But then, the cries returned. They were faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind. But as the nights passed, they grew louder, closer. A baby's wail, a woman's scream, and the heavy beat of wings outside her motel window. One night, Sophia woke to the sound of scratching at her door. She froze, her heart pounding as the sound grew more insistent. She reached for her camera, the only weapon she had, and crept toward the door. "It's just the wind," she whispered to herself, though she didn't believe it. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low, guttural sound that sent chills down her spine. Then, a voice, soft, pleading, and eerily familiar. "Sophia, help me." Her breath caught in her throat. It was Diego's voice, the boy who had disappeared weeks earlier. Against every instinct, she reached for the doorknob, her trembling hand inches from the cold metal. But then she remembered Father Emilio's warning, "Do not answer the cries." She stepped back, clutching the rosary the priest had given her. The voice outside grew louder, more desperate, but Sophia held her ground. Eventually, the cries stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence. The next morning, she found claw marks on the door and a single feather lying on the threshold. Desperate for answers, Sophia returned to the ruins of the altar. The clearing was eerily quiet, the ground scorched black from the fire. She searched the area, hoping to find some clue, some indication that the curse had truly been broken. Instead, she found something far worse. Etched into the charred earth were new symbols, glowing faintly in the fading light. They were similar to those she had seen before, but they formed a new pattern, one she didn't recognize. As she traced the shapes with her fingers, a chilling realization struck her. The symbols were meant to bind, to tether something, not to the town, but to her. Lechuza hadn't been destroyed. The fire had severed her connection to the town, but it had also freed her. And now, she was tethered to Sophia. That night, Sophia prepared for the final confrontation. She packed a bag with everything she thought she might need: holy water, a lighter, salt, and the camera that had captured every terrifying moment of her journey. She didn't know if any of it would be enough, but she couldn't keep running. The cries started as soon as the sun set. This time, they weren't distant. They came from all around her, filling the air with an unearthly chorus that made her skin crawl. Sophia drove to the edge of the woods, the rosary clutched tightly in her hand. The forest seemed alive with movement, shadows darting between the trees, branches swaying as though pushed by an unseen force. She stepped out of the car, her flashlight slicing through the darkness, and began walking toward the clearing. The altar was gone, reduced to ash, but the symbols glowed brightly, as if feeding off the energy of the night. And there, standing at the center, was Lechuza. The creature's wings were spread wide, its feathers shimmering like glass in the moonlight. Its human-like face twisted into a grotesque smile as it watched Sophia approach. The cries grew louder, emanating from the creature as though it carried the voices of countless souls within it. "Why me?" Sophia shouted, her voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" Lechuza tilted its head, its glowing eyes boring into her. Then it spoke, not with its mouth, but directly into her mind. The words were fragmented, incomprehensible, but the intent was clear. The creature wanted Sophia to suffer, to carry the fear and despair it thrived on. Summoning every ounce of courage, Sophia reached into her bag and pulled out the lighter. She poured salt into the shape of a circle around herself, hoping the old law would offer some protection. The creature screeched, its wings beating the air as it lunged at her. Sophia lit the lighter, holding it out in front of her like a shield. The flame flickered, casting shadows that danced across the glowing symbols. The creature hesitated, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if it were fighting against an invisible force. "You're not going to win," Sophia said, her voice firm despite the terror coursing through her. "You don't control me." With a final burst of strength, Sophia threw the lighter onto the ground. The flames ignited the dry earth, consuming the symbols in a blaze of light. Lechuza let out a deafening screech, its form writhing as it tried to escape the fire. When the flames died, the creature was gone. The clearing was silent, the oppressive energy lifted. Sophia collapsed to her knees, her body shaking as she realized it was over. But as she made her way back to the car, she noticed something on the windshield. A single feather, pristine and white, as if untouched by the fire. Lechuza was gone, for now. But Sophia knew it wasn't the end. The creature was patient, and its vengeance was eternal. And somewhere, in the shadows of the night, it was waiting for the next call to be answered.